Leaders Eat Last. Now, why did I choose this book? Simply because I'm a great fan of the author Simon Sinek. He is a brilliant author, excellent speaker. And me being a professional speaker and a CFO turned business and leadership coach, it was more out of selfish reasons. I said, I might probably get a lot of insights reading this book. And of course, I was just not at all disappointed reading this book. Now, if I were to tell you about this book, imagine a big, juicy orange in front of you. And you're waiting to extract juice and drink it. That's how I felt when I looked at the book. As I started reading, and in fact, when I completed the book, I was expecting probably like a big jar of juice. The jar wasn't full, but the juice or the essence of the book that I got was phenomenal. The taste of the juice, it's so yum. It was like that. That's the feeling I got once I read this book. And the author has excellently divided the book into 8 parts. And before that, in the blurb, he has defined a leader. Now, what is a leader? Or rather, who is a leader according to him? He says, leader means they choose to go first into the danger. And leaders would sacrifice what is theirs to save what is ours, and it's not the other way around. So he says that's the definition of a leader. So in these 8 parts, I'll quickly take you all through certain parts that was like really stood out for me. So the first part is, he says, our need to feel safe. And in this section, he highlights the importance of having empathy, trust, and belongingness, which are very, very essential for excellent leadership qualities. So he starts off with the story of Johnny Bravo, who was a pilot, and he was a part of the mission that fought the Taliban in Afghanistan. So on a pitch dark night, this guy was in the flight, and he goes ahead and he saves 22 men. Pure leadership skill. And he says Johnny Bravo actually risked his life so that he could save the lives of the others. He did not get a bonus. He did not get a promotion, nor was he given an award, nor did he go to any offsite. No media attention either, but yet he went ahead and did this. Why? Because he says it was part of my job. He says that is what is so important. Therefore, he says, when empathy is injected, trust would be the new standard in any organization. He says, trust your employees. Trust them to take coffee breaks. Don't have a bell that rings, right? And then in a manufacturing company, when the spare parts were kept locked inside, the signal that you're giving the employees is like, hey, you know what? I don't trust you guys. And that's why I've kept it locked. So he says, these sort of signaling is when people feel they're not trusted. And for a leader, trust, empathy, and belongingness becomes very important. He says if we sense any sort of danger, our defenses go up. And if we feel safe among our people, we are relaxed, we feel more open, we are open to trust and cooperation. He also says, sadly, it's common for leaders in companies to see people as the means to drive the numbers, the financial performance of the business. They just look at that and not the people aspect. So he says, offer trust, empathy, and very importantly, create the circle of safety. He says, without a circle of safety, people are forced to spend too much time and energy. They're protecting themselves from each other. And if there is a circle of safety, you feel the belongingness. The time we spend to getting to know people who are not part of what it takes, right? That's what helps us to form the trust. He says that's exactly the reason why it's important. Families, they say a family that eats together stays together. So he says that same concept is applicable in an organization as well. Get to know your colleagues even outside of work. He encourages that. And the best companies that make it through the hard times because people rally and they make sure they go and achieve what is required. So he says, build and maintain your circle of safety at work, and pointing fingers is not the solution. The second part is something very different. Nobody would have expected, but you may have heard him talk about this, the role of the hormones. He says these are the powerful forces. You know, we must be wondering, what does hormones have to do with leadership? So he talks about EDSO. E standing for endorphins, which is the purpose to mask physical pain. Like the runner's high, you know, when you complete a marathon, you feel yay on top of the world, right? That's the endorphin that does that. Then you have the dopamine, that's the D. It's the reason for good feeling. It gives a feeling of satisfaction, progress, and accomplishments. And he says a corporate's vision statement must be something we must be able to see in our mind's eye. Social media gives us the dopamine because, and that's why it's an addiction, but we don't realize it's an addiction. In contrast to the E and D are the S and O, which are the selfless chemicals that make us feel valued and gives us the feeling of trust and belongingness. And that is what creates the circle of safety. The S is your serotonin, which gives us the feeling of pride. It's a leadership chemical, actually, and it's a feeling that of being liked and respected. And it makes us feel strong and confident. And that's why you have awards and recognitions in corporates. Parents also feel proud about their children's accomplishments, and that's the serotonin high that they get. The other one, the O, is the oxytocin, which is the chemical love. Feeling of friendship, love, deep trust. And it's all vital for our survival instincts. And it's needed for empathy and generosity. So the dopamine gives us the instant gratification, and oxytocin is long-lasting. In contrast to all of this is the cortisol. Cortisol is responsible for the stress and the anxiety that we experience. Cortisol is not supposed to stay in our system because it's supposed to fire off the threat and leave thereafter. Cortisol inhibits the release of oxytocin. So you see, they're not complementary to each other. When people invest, when they have to invest their time and energy, and if they have to safeguard themselves from politics or dangers within the company, that's what makes people more selfish, and they're not concerned about each other. He also says, think of employees like your children. You're not going to get rid of your children just because you're having a hard time, right? So he says that's how it should be in organizations as well. And to find a lasting sense of pride, there must be a parent or a coach or a teacher or a leader to back them up. And that's when people put their best foot forward. The part 3 and part 4, I'm not going to take you through much of that. It talks about reality, and then it tells you about how we got here, about the World War and other things. I'm not getting into that. The part 5 is something interesting. He talks about the abstract challenge. There was an experiment that was conducted, and although it was condemned, there was this guy called Milgram. And this experiment had 2 volunteers. I mean, a batch of many people. They were clubbed into 2. One was a teacher, another was a student. The student was actually a scientist, but the teacher did not know about it. What did this experiment do? The teacher had to ask a series of questions to the students. And if the student didn't answer it correctly, the teacher had to flip a switch. It's just a switch. But what happens to the student? There's an electric shock that happens. The range of the switches were from mild to intense shock, which means the intense level, as the intensity increases, it could harm the other person. The person may even die. And that's why this was condemned. And this experiment had 4 variations. The first level, the teacher had to physically put the student's hand in the shock plate. The second variation, they were seated next to each other, which meant they could see and hear when the student was in pain and was crying and shouting. The third level, they were seated in 2 separate rooms, but the teacher could see the student but not hear their cries. And the fourth one was they are in completely separate rooms where they cannot see and hear each other. So the volunteers expressed concern on causing pain, hearing them cry and everything. They said, should we just continue about this? I'm harming another person. So of course this was enacted, and then they were told, no, please continue. So if they asked again, they would say, no, this experiment requires you to continue. And the third time they would say, it's absolutely essential that you continue. So therefore, many of them were continuing. However, if they really protested, then they would end it immediately. Now, what do you think were the results of this? In the first variation, about 70% of them quit. And in the last variation, it was only about 35% of the people who quit, which meant the 65% of them were actually continuing this. They were actually killing somebody. I mean, they may have killed somebody. So he says it's no different in companies, because the bigger the companies get, there is more physical distance between us. We are distanced by numerical abstractions, and we are capable of inhuman behavior. Isn't that shocking? He says the impact on the lives of people who cannot be seen or heard, we are capable of doing much more harm to them. Leaders who put premium on the numbers over the lives are more often physically separated from the people. So he says, if we were to translate this experiment, it means that about 650 leaders out of the 1,000 Fortune companies are capable to make decisions without consideration for impact on the lives of human beings. The part 6 is about destruction abundance. So here he takes through a very nice 5 leadership lessons. The first one is, so goes the culture, so goes the company. He gives the example of Goldman Sachs, where he says the long-term greedy means worth taking a short-term hit to help your client, because loyalty and trust is produced. He says earlier on, if an IPO was underwritten by Goldman Sachs, it was akin to good housekeeping and a seal of approval. However, with their new mentality, what happened? They started putting academic pedigree before and the cultural fit thereafter. And that's why he says it was just built on short-term targets. So in a weak culture, we veer away from doing the right things. He also gives the example of a 26/11 attack of Taj that happened. And he says that was because of the result of the culture the leaders had instilled. In contrast to Goldman Sachs, he gives a very nice example of 3M. We all use Post-its, right? So the story of Post-its. Strong adhesive. There was a scientist in 3M who was trying to come up with a strong adhesive, but he wasn't successful. And he said, why should I just throw this? Let me keep it there. Probably somebody else from the organization may have a requirement at a later date. A few years later, another of 3M scientists, he was in the church, and he was trying to play his musical notes. The pages wasn't staying. And then he thought, it'll be so nice if my bookmark didn't fall and, if it just stood right there. And that's what triggered the creation of Post-its. So he says 3M knows that people do their best work when they work together, when they are able to share ideas and comfortably borrow each other's work for their own projects. They believe in innovation from interaction. The second leadership lesson is, so goes the leader, so goes the culture. He talks about Saddam Hussein here and how it creates mistrust. In the corporate parlance, he gives the example of Merrill Lynch. And apparently their CFO, somebody by name O'Neill, had impressed his boss, and he quickly rose to become the president. And how did he manage to impress the boss? By laying off people. And slowly the trust started to evaporate. And we know what happened, because he despised the employee-centric culture and he made it all about intense competition. Because a leader is the one who sets the tone in the organization. And he says that's why the culture of Merrill Lynch took a complete shift. The third leadership lesson is again interesting, something that we know, but he's highlighted it beautifully. Integrity matters. He gives an example of an officer candidate in the Marine Corps. He got sacked, for what? He was found sleeping. But that was not the actual reason why he got sacked. When he was caught sleeping, he said, no, I wasn't sleeping. And he finally admitted it when they gave him an irrefutable proof. So the thought behind this is your integrity. You were lying, and that's why he was sacked. Whereas another marine who was just sleeping and who admitted to it, he was just punished. So he talks about the importance of integrity. He also gives a nice example of Ralph Lauren, where the company got to know that they had given bribes in Argentina just to evade taxes. They sounded the alarm, and they themselves went and admitted and paid about $1.6 million just to save their reputation. So he says, building trust requires nothing more than just telling the truth. The fourth leadership lesson is about the friends. Friends matter. The fifth leadership lesson is lead the people, not the numbers. And he again talks about this very nice example of Jack Welch of GE. He says, yes, he was very remarkable, but he also says that GE's trajectory matched the trajectory of the market while Welch was in power. And his theory is, a man brilliant at developing systems to maximize the short-term value, but great companies and great leaders are able to succeed beyond any one leader, and they're able to manage through the hard times, because that's what the leadership legacy is all about. And it needs to be strong leadership legacy that a great leader leaves behind. And he says GE was able to maximize the opportunity of the day when numbers mattered more than people. Numbers never saves anyone in the hard time. What saves is people. The founder of Costco, James Sinek, he knew that if the company treated their employees like family, the employees would reciprocate it with trust and loyalty. And Costco also knew that it's a lot more profitable in the long term if you minimize the employee turnover and maximize employee productivity, commitment, and loyalty. While companies like Costco use layoff as the last resort, he says companies like GE use it as a routine strategy. And that made me wonder how relevant it is in the current times, especially the post-pandemic. There are so many layoffs, mass layoffs that are happening. So what is their thought process behind them? He also says, can you imagine getting rid of one of your children just because you made less money than you expected last year? How would your kids feel about it? And he says it's no different in organizations as well, because a leader is like a parent. The seventh part is about the society of addict. It talks about the millennials, the social media and other things. And the last part is becoming the leader. He gives a very nice example of Alcohol Anonymous. He says, unless they make it to the step 12, it's most likely they'll drink again. So what is the step 12? Step 12 is all about service. When they actually help another alcoholic from not drinking. So he says leadership is all about service. Profit is a mean to serve people who work. It is a fuel, not a destination. So he says serve the people and they will serve the customer. Leadership is not a license to do less, but it is a responsibility to do more. And it's a commitment to human beings. That is the essence of the book that I was telling you about. Could there have been something better in the book? This is my perspective. I thought, the essence of the book is so beautiful. He could have cut the flab probably. The flab, he's spoken a lot about millennials. Of course, it's beautiful. But to me, I wasn't able to fit it much into the leadership context. I was looking for more meat on leadership. He's talking about parenting, the millennials, the world war, and many other things which I have omitted because I wanted just the essence of leadership. What was really good about the book, of course, the essence of leadership and the way he supplemented it with brilliant stories and case studies. Some of the case studies is what I shared with you. And to conclude, I would say that I must admit that he's a much better and a lot engaging speaker than an author. Even though I do like him and his books, I thought as an author, he's a lot more effective. So that is the gist from my lens.